On an ordinary Thursday afternoon in October 2023, Hannah sat in her therapist's waiting room, waiting for her weekly 3 p.m. appointment. She'd been going to this therapist, a woman named Catherine Mercer, for 4 years. 4 years of showing up every single week, sitting on that same cream-colored couch, and sharing the parts of herself that were still broken. This was Hannah's sanctuary. This room was where she'd learned to trust herself again, where she'd learned that what happened to her mattered, where she'd learned that she wasn't crazy for feeling hurt by someone who claimed to love her. Hannah scrolled through Instagram while she waited. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just passing time the way people do. Then she saw a photo on her feed. It was a photo from a restaurant. 2 people. A woman's arm around a man's shoulder, both smiling. The caption said, "Finally ready to show you off." Hannah's hands went numb. She zoomed in on the photo. The woman was Catherine, her therapist. The woman who had been treating her trauma for 4 years. The professional who had listened to every painful detail of Hannah's worst experiences. The man was Derek, her abusive ex. The person who had hurt her. The person Hannah had come to Catherine to heal from. They were together, in a restaurant, looking like a couple. Hannah stared at the photo for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Her brain was trying to process something it couldn't comprehend. This isn't real. This is a misunderstanding. It's someone who looks like Derek. It's someone who looks like Catherine. It's photoshopped. Something. Anything but what she was looking at. But it was real. She could see the scar on Derek's eyebrow, the one from a childhood accident he'd told her about years ago. She could see the specific way he smiled. She could see his tattoo on his collarbone. And she could see Catherine's hand on his shoulder in a way that was unmistakably intimate. The photo was dated 2 months ago. 2 months. Catherine had been secretly dating Derek while Hannah was in therapy with her. While Hannah was paying Catherine to help her heal from Derek's abuse, Catherine was in Derek's bed. Hannah heard footsteps. Catherine was coming to get her from the waiting room. Catherine appeared in the doorway, and the moment Catherine saw Hannah's face, the moment Catherine saw the phone in Hannah's hands, Catherine's expression changed. She knew. Caught. Catherine started to speak. "Hannah, I can explain." But Hannah didn't wait to hear the explanation. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked past Catherine without saying anything. She walked out of that office and didn't go back. What Hannah didn't know yet, what she would discover only after requesting her complete therapy file from Catherine's office, was that the betrayal was far deeper than a secret relationship. The betrayal had been happening for 2 years. In every single therapy session after Catherine started dating Derek, Catherine had been systematically invalidating Hannah's trauma. Catherine had been rewriting Hannah's history in her clinical notes. Catherine had been gaslit Hannah about her own valid instincts. Catherine had taken everything Hannah shared and used it against her. When Hannah finally read those therapy files, she would discover that while she was paying Catherine $150 a week to help her heal, Catherine was actually helping Derek rewrite his own narrative. Catherine was using her professional authority as a licensed therapist to convince herself, and to document, that Derek wasn't abusive, that Hannah was the problem, that Hannah was paranoid, controlling, and unstable. And Catherine had gaslit Hannah into believing it too. To understand the depth of this betrayal, it's important to understand who Hannah was before everything fell apart, and who Catherine was when Hannah first walked into her office. Hannah's breakup with Derek happened in early 2019. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow realization that the person she loved was systematically making her feel small. Derek was 31 when they met. He was charming. He had a good job in finance. He seemed like someone who had his life together. For the first 6 months, Hannah felt lucky. Lucky that someone like Derek had chosen her. Lucky that she got to be with him. But around month 8, something shifted. Derek started making comments about the way Hannah looked. Her clothes weren't flattering. Her hair would look better if she styled it differently. Her makeup was too heavy. These comments came frequently enough that Hannah stopped dressing the way she liked. She started trying to look the way Derek wanted her to look. Then the comments extended to her career. Hannah worked in nonprofit administration. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't high-paying, but it was meaningful work. She helped run programs that supported domestic violence survivors. The irony of that detail, of Hannah spending her days helping abuse survivors while being abused at home, she wouldn't fully understand until years later. Derek worked in finance. To him, nonprofit work was nice, but not ambitious. He'd suggest Hannah could do something more impressive if she wanted to be taken seriously. He made it clear that her career, to him, was a failure. Hannah internalized that. She started feeling like her work didn't matter, like she was somehow failing by not being as successful as Derek. Derek also controlled their finances. He wanted to know where every dollar went. When Hannah bought something, groceries, clothing, anything, he'd ask her about it. Not aggressively, just curious. But the cumulative effect was that Hannah felt watched. She felt accountable for her spending. She started asking permission before buying things she needed. Derek isolated Hannah from her friends and family. He didn't forbid it. He was more subtle than that. He'd mention that her best friend Jessica was flaky and unreliable. He'd say her college roommate Maya seemed jealous of Hannah and toxic. He'd comment that her family was judgmental and didn't understand their relationship. Over time, Hannah spent less time with people who loved her. Not because Derek explicitly told her not to, but because he'd made her doubt them. She found herself alone with just him. At home, Derek was cold. He was distant. He was occasionally explosive in ways that were verbal rather than physical. He'd accuse Hannah of things she hadn't done, of not caring about him, of being selfish, of ruining his day with her neediness. Then he'd apologize. He'd bring flowers. He'd be tender and apologetic. And Hannah would feel relief. She would think, maybe I was being insensitive. Maybe I was being selfish. She would forgive him. The cycle would begin again. By the end of year 2, Hannah had isolated herself almost completely. She'd lost most of her friendships because Derek had convinced her those friends were toxic. She was questioning every decision she made. She felt like she was never good enough. She felt like the problem in the relationship was her. In year 3, Hannah reached a breaking point. She didn't wake up one day with a dramatic revelation. It was more subtle than that. She woke up and realized she didn't recognize herself anymore. She'd become smaller. She'd become quiet. She'd become someone who was constantly apologizing for existing. She told Derek she was leaving. He cried. He said he loved her. He said he couldn't live without her. He said he'd change. But Hannah left anyway. What followed was 3 months of doubt. She replayed every moment of the relationship. She wondered if she'd been too harsh, too sensitive, too ungrateful. Derek had done nice things for her. He'd paid for trips. He'd helped with rent. How could she leave someone who'd been so supportive? Hannah spiraled. She couldn't concentrate at work. She cried at random moments. She wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. 3 months later, Hannah found Catherine's website. It said, specializing in emotional abuse recovery, relationship trauma, and rebuilding after betrayal. It felt like the universe was telling her what she needed to hear. You were abused. There's someone who specializes in this. You're not crazy. Hannah called and made an appointment. That first session with Catherine changed everything. Catherine's office was warm and comfortable. Catherine herself was attentive and professional. Hannah started talking about Derek, and Catherine listened in a way that made Hannah feel heard rather than judged. Catherine said things Hannah had never heard anyone say. What you experienced is emotional abuse, even though it wasn't physical. His charm with other people doesn't change what he did to you at home. You were smart to leave. That took real courage. Your instincts were right to feel something was wrong. Hannah cried. For the first time since leaving Derek, she felt like she wasn't crazy. She felt validated. She felt like someone finally understood. Over the following months, therapy with Catherine became the most important part of Hannah's week. She disclosed everything. Specific moments when Derek hurt her. Times he'd criticized her. Ways he'd isolated her. Details about how he'd controlled their finances. She told Catherine about her shame for staying so long. Her insecurity about whether she deserved love. She told Catherine things she'd never told anyone. And Catherine listened. Catherine validated. Catherine said, that wasn't your fault. Your body is having a normal response to an abnormal situation. Healing isn't linear. Some days will be harder than others. You deserve to be loved, and you will be. By the end of the first year, Hannah was healing. She was sleeping better. She was laughing again. She was even dating again. Carefully, with good boundaries, being intentional about who she let into her life. Catherine had done her job brilliantly. Hannah was getting better. Hannah trusted Catherine completely. Because Catherine had been trustworthy. Because Catherine had listened. Because Catherine had validated Hannah's experience when no one else had. That's what made what came next so devastating. To truly understand the betrayal that was coming, it's important to understand exactly what Hannah had survived with Derek. Because when Catherine began rewriting that narrative, Hannah had to confront the possibility that maybe Derek wasn't as bad as she'd thought. Maybe she had been too sensitive. Maybe she had been the problem. And that reframing of her own abuse became the second abuse. Derek was charming. That's the first thing to understand about people like Derek. They're not obvious abusers. They don't hit. They don't scream all the time. They're charming. They're smart. They're someone people like when they meet them socially. When Hannah met Derek in 2016, he seemed perfect. He paid attention to her. He remembered things she said. He made her feel special. He made her feel lucky to be with him. But abuse isn't about a single incident. It's about a pattern. It's about the slow, systematic erosion of someone's sense of self. The comments about Hannah's appearance started around month 8. They seemed like he was trying to help her. "I'm just trying to make you better," he'd say, when she mentioned that the comments hurt. "Why are you so sensitive?" Hannah internalized the message. "My sensitivity is the problem. He's trying to help, and I'm making it difficult." The criticism of her career came next. He'd mention, casually, that nonprofit work was nice but not ambitious. He'd suggest she could do something more impressive if she wanted to be taken seriously. The implication was clear. What Hannah did for work didn't matter. She didn't matter as much as he did. Hannah internalized that too. "My career is a failure. I'm not as successful as he is. I should be grateful he wants to be with me." The financial control was subtle. He wanted to know where every dollar went. If Hannah spent money on herself, on coffee, on clothes, on anything, he'd ask about it. He'd question her decisions. He'd make her defend her purchases. Hannah started feeling like she didn't have the right to spend her own money. She started asking permission. She started making purchases in secret because it was easier than defending them. The isolation from friends and family was perhaps the most insidious part. Derek never said, "You can't see your friends." He said things like, "I'm worried Jessica is flaky. I just don't want to see you get hurt when she cancels on you. Your family seems really judgmental. I don't think they're being supportive of us. Maya seems jealous of our relationship. I'm not sure she's a good influence on you." These comments seemed concerned. They seemed caring. They seemed like Derek was looking out for Hannah. But what Derek was actually doing was isolating her. He was making Hannah doubt the people who loved her. He was cutting her off from her support system. By year 2, Hannah had no one to talk to except Derek. That's when the control became complete. At home, Derek was cold and distant. He would accuse Hannah of things she hadn't done, of not caring about him, of being selfish, of ruining his mood. Then he'd apologize. He'd say he was stressed. He'd bring flowers. He'd be kind and tender. And Hannah would feel relieved. But it was a cycle. The apology wasn't real change. It was just the beginning of the next round. Hannah started walking on eggshells. She started trying to anticipate his moods. She started being very, very careful about what she said. She started making herself smaller and quieter. By year 3, Hannah was exhausted. She was depressed. She was someone she didn't recognize. When she finally left, it wasn't because of a single dramatic incident. It was because she woke up one morning and realized she couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't spend one more day trying to be small enough not to upset him. She told him she was leaving. He cried. He begged her not to go. He said he'd change. Hannah left anyway. And then, in the 3 months that followed, Derek's absence made Hannah doubt everything. She replayed memories. In some moments, the abuse seemed crystal clear. In other moments, she wondered if she was overreacting. He paid for some things. He could be charming. Surely that balanced out the criticism and the isolation and the control. That's why she needed therapy. That's why Catherine's validation was so crucial. Catherine was the one who said, "No, what he did was abuse. Your leaving was the right choice." Catherine was the expert. Catherine had degrees and credentials and training. When Catherine said Hannah's instincts were right, Hannah could finally believe it. What Hannah didn't know was that Catherine would soon become the person who made her doubt those instincts all over again. By spring 2021, Hannah had been in therapy with Catherine for almost 2 years. She was genuinely healing. The weight she'd been carrying since leaving Derek was finally starting to lift. She'd started dating again. Not desperately, but intentionally. She was being careful about who she let into her life. She was setting boundaries. She was recognizing red flags in ways she hadn't before. She'd also started reconnecting with her friends. She'd called Jessica and apologized for pulling away. She'd reached out to Maya. She'd spent time with her family. Healing wasn't linear. Some weeks were harder than others, but the trajectory was toward recovery. Then, in a therapy session in March 2021, Catherine mentioned, casually, something that stuck with Hannah. "I ran into someone I used to know. He was in one of those relationships where his partner was very difficult and controlling. He's starting therapy to process it. Hannah didn't think much of it. Lots of people were in difficult relationships. But Catherine kept mentioning this person. Over the next few weeks, in various sessions, Catherine would bring him up again. She'd add details. How kind he was. How he'd made sacrifices in that relationship, but the other person didn't appreciate them. How he was working on himself, through therapy, which showed real personal growth. On some level, Hannah's instincts screamed. Something about this was wrong. Why was Catherine talking about her personal relationships so much? Why was Catherine giving so much detail about someone she knew? Hannah felt uncomfortable. But she'd also learned in therapy to doubt her instincts. Catherine was the expert. Catherine had helped Hannah so much. Hannah didn't want to be paranoid. She didn't want to be one of those people who suspected everyone. So she talked herself out of her discomfort. She minimized her own concerns. She convinced herself she was being unreasonable. Then, in a session in May 2021, Hannah asked Catherine directly, "Do you know him? The person you mentioned?" Catherine's response was smooth and professional. "It's not relevant to your therapy. Let's focus on you." Catherine redirected immediately. She shut down Hannah's question without really answering it. It was professional. It was appropriate. It was also a lie. And Hannah felt the sting of it. But she also felt like she shouldn't have asked. Like she'd been inappropriate. Like she was projecting her insecurities onto Catherine's personal life. Later, when Hannah read Catherine's clinical notes from that session, she would see what Catherine had written. Client asked if I've ever run into Derek. I deflected. Client seems paranoid about my social circle. Discussed client's tendency to be controlling in relationships. Noted this may be a pattern for client. Catherine had lied. And then documented Hannah's correct suspicion as evidence of Hannah's psychological pathology. This is gaslighting. This is what happens when someone in a position of authority weaponizes that authority against someone who is vulnerable. Hannah's instinct was right. She had picked up on something real. Her body was telling her something was wrong. Her instincts were working. But Catherine, the expert, the person Hannah trusted more than anyone, had convinced her that her instinct was wrong, that it was a sign of her own problems, that she was being paranoid and controlling. Hannah started doubting herself more. She became anxious about trusting her own perceptions. She second-guessed her instincts. And that was exactly what Catherine needed to happen in order to keep the secret. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one, and if this story is hitting close to home, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what's coming next. In spring 2021, Catherine and Derek started dating. Hannah didn't know, but Catherine did. Catherine would see Derek outside of therapy hours. They'd go to restaurants together. They'd go to movies. They'd spend nights together. By summer 2021, Catherine had fallen in love with Derek. Derek would tell Catherine his version of the relationship with Hannah. That Hannah was controlling, that she was demanding, that she didn't appreciate him, that she was too sensitive, that she was the one who was actually abusive to him. Catherine, who had heard Hannah's story in therapy, all the specific details, all the documented trauma, chose to believe Derek's version instead. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that Catherine couldn't accept the reality of who Derek was. Catherine couldn't accept that she was dating someone who had been emotionally abusive to another person. So Catherine rewrote the narrative. She told herself Derek's story. She convinced herself that Hannah had been exaggerating or distorting events. As Catherine's relationship with Derek deepened, her clinical stance toward Hannah shifted. And this shift is visible in the therapy notes she kept. In early 2019 and 2020, Catherine had documented, "Client demonstrates clear PTSD symptoms from prolonged emotional abuse. Derek's behavior pattern matches emotional abuse profile, systematic isolation, financial control, chronic criticism, emotional withdrawal, occasional verbal explosions. Client is showing healthy boundary setting by ending the relationship." These notes were accurate. They reflected what Hannah had told her. They showed Catherine understanding the reality of Hannah's experience. But by spring 2021, when Catherine was secretly dating Derek, the notes changed. Client may be exaggerating Derek's behavior due to her own insecurities and need for control. Derek's perspective is that he felt controlled by client. Client may be misinterpreting his actions through trauma lens. Client shows signs of personality traits that may make relationships difficult for her. This is reframing. This is Catherine taking Hannah's documented trauma and repositioning it as Hannah's pathology. By fall 2021, the notes had shifted even further. Client fixates on Derek's perceived slights. discussed how clients' triggers may be disproportionate to actual events. Derek expressed that he felt blamed for misunderstandings in relationship. Client needs to develop more perspective and less emotional reactivity. Catherine was now documenting Derek's defense of his own behavior, not as something to analyze clinically, but as truth that contradicted Hannah's understanding of events. By 2022, the notes read, "I explained to the client that her perception of events may be filtered through her trauma lens, and that this may be causing her to misinterpret benign situations as threatening. Client seemed to accept this insight." Catherine had gaslit Hannah about her own trauma. In a therapy session, Catherine had told Hannah that her perceptions were distorted, and Hannah, who had come to Catherine because she couldn't trust her own perceptions, had accepted this insight from an expert. By 2023, 4 years into Hannah's therapy, 4 years of Hannah paying Catherine $150 per week, Catherine's notes had completely inverted the clinical picture. Client has a pattern of being overly controlling in relationships. This may be contributing to her difficulty finding stable romantic partnerships. Discussed client's tendency to be paranoid about partners' social circles. Noted this mirrors earlier relationships. Recommend client continue working on these personality patterns. Hannah, the victim of abuse, had been reframed as the perpetrator. The abuser had been reframed as the victim. And Hannah had no idea it was happening. Meanwhile, Catherine and Derek's relationship became more public. They were going to dinners together. They were taking weekend trips. They were being seen together in their community. Catherine was falling deeper in love with him. Derek was getting something he needed, a professional's validation. A licensed therapist, someone with credentials and authority, was siding with him. This gave Derek confidence. It gave him proof. When anyone questioned his behavior, he could reference the fact that his girlfriend was a therapist, and she understood that Hannah was the problem. Catherine was getting what she needed too. A boyfriend who made her feel special, who was charming in public, who fit the narrative she'd constructed where he was the victim of an overly sensitive, controlling woman. And Hannah was in therapy, paying to be gaslit by the one person she'd trusted to help her heal. After Hannah saw the Instagram photo in October 2023, she didn't go back to therapy. She couldn't face Catherine. She couldn't sit across from Catherine, in that supposedly safe office knowing what she now knew. Instead, she did something that terrified her. She requested her complete therapy file from Catherine's office. Under the law, she had the right to all her records. Under HIPAA, Catherine had to provide them within 30 days. When the file arrived, Hannah sat alone in her apartment and read through 4 years of Catherine's clinical notes. For the first 100 pages, she recognized herself in those notes. The observations were accurate. The clinical assessment was correct. Catherine had documented Hannah's trauma carefully and professionally. Then she got to spring 2021. And she watched, page by page, as her own trauma was reframed as her own pathology. She read a note from May 2021. Client asked if I've ever run into Derek. I deflected. Client seems paranoid about my social circle. Discussed client's tendency to be controlling in relationships. Noted this may be a pattern for client. Catherine had documented her own lie as a clinical observation of Hannah's mental health problems. Hannah's hands shook as she continued reading. She saw the systematic shift in Catherine's language. Client experienced abuse became client may be exaggerating. Derek's behavior was abusive became client may be misinterpreting Derek's actions. She saw Catherine use clinical language to gaslight her. Here's one note that particularly devastated her. I explained to the client that her perception of events may be filtered through her trauma lens, and that this may be causing her to misinterpret benign situations as threatening. Client seemed to accept this insight. Catherine had gaslit Hannah about her own valid perceptions, and then documented the gaslighting as therapeutic progress. At the very end of the file was a note from late September 2023, just 2 weeks before Hannah saw the Instagram photo. Client continues to show improvement. Continue current treatment plan. The same treatment plan that consisted of Catherine systematically invalidating Hannah's trauma in order to protect her relationship with Derek. Hannah sat with those files for hours. She read them over and over. She was trying to understand a fundamental question. Did Catherine ever actually believe her, or was it all an act from the beginning? The answer was complicated. Catherine had believed Hannah in 2019 and 2020. Catherine's early clinical notes showed genuine understanding of Hannah's trauma. But once Catherine started dating Derek, Catherine faced a choice. Believe Hannah or believe Derek? Catherine chose Derek. And to make that choice feel acceptable, Catherine reframed Hannah's reality. Catherine told herself stories about Hannah being paranoid, controlling, and manipulative. Catherine used her professional authority to document these stories as clinical observations. It wasn't that Catherine consciously decided to harm Hannah. It was that Catherine rationalized her behavior so thoroughly that she stopped seeing it as harmful. Hannah read through the notes one more time, and she had a realization that broke her heart. Somewhere along the way, Catherine had begun to believe her own narrative. Catherine had convinced herself that Derek was the victim and Hannah was the perpetrator, which meant Catherine would never apologize. Catherine would never take responsibility. Catherine would go on believing her own story. Hannah filed a complaint with the state licensing board. It took everything she had to do it. Catherine was a respected therapist with 20 years of practice. Hannah was just a client with a history of trauma. The system hadn't always protected people like Hannah. Why would they protect her now? But Hannah compiled everything she had. She made copies of her therapy file. She documented the shift in Catherine's clinical stance. She included the Instagram photo. She wrote a detailed account of the moment in therapy when Catherine had gaslit her instincts. She submitted it all to the state licensing board and waited. 3 weeks later, she got a call from an investigator. The investigator's name was Detective Sarah Chen. She said the state licensing board was opening an investigation. Then she said something that stopped Hannah's breath. "You're not the only one." The second victim, Sarah, had been in therapy with Catherine at a different time. Catherine had mentioned dating someone connected to Sarah's ex. Sarah eventually discovered Catherine was dating someone in the same professional circles as her ex. When Sarah expressed concerns about Catherine's objectivity in their therapy sessions, Catherine had documented her as having boundary issues and poor relationship judgment. The third victim, Rachel, had started therapy with Catherine way back in 2015. Catherine had eventually started dating someone in professional circles connected to Rachel's ex. When Rachel mentioned concerns about Catherine's behavior, Catherine had documented those concerns as evidence of Rachel's paranoia and distorted thinking. The pattern was unmistakable. And when the licensing board did a deeper investigation, they found it went back even further. In 2008, a client had filed a complaint about Catherine's objectivity. The complaint had been dismissed as a misunderstanding. In 2013, another client's concerns had been noted but dismissed as the client's distorted perception. In 2017, yet another client had mentioned concerns about Catherine's judgment, again dismissed as paranoia. The system had failed to protect these victims, but now, with 3 current victims coming forward with detailed documentation, the board had to act. The investigation took months. Catherine was interviewed. She defended herself. She said she wasn't treating Derek as a client, so there was no therapeutic boundary violation. She said Hannah was projecting her anxiety onto Catherine's personal life. She said she had a right to a personal life. She never apologized, not once. When the licensing board held the hearing in 2024, all 3 victims were allowed to testify. Hannah sat in that hearing room and told her story. She talked about how safe she felt in therapy with Catherine, how she disclosed everything to Catherine because she trusted her, how Catherine validated her trauma in early therapy sessions, how Catherine then systematically invalidated that same trauma to protect her relationship with Derek, how Hannah was gaslit in the one place that was supposed to be completely safe. Sarah testified about the same pattern. Rachel testified about concerns from nearly a decade ago that were ignored. Catherine testified and defended herself. She said the clients were misremembering events. She said she'd always maintained appropriate boundaries. She said she was being persecuted for having a personal life. The board deliberated for 2 weeks. When they issued their decision, it was definitive. Catherine's license was permanently revoked. She could never practice therapy again in any state. She would also have to pay damages to each victim. The news became public record. Catherine's name appeared in the state licensing board's disciplinary actions. Every therapist referral database now showed her revocation. Universities where she'd taught as a guest lecturer distanced themselves. Her colleagues stopped responding to her emails. Catherine went from a respected expert to a cautionary tale. Her reputation, built over 20 years of practice, was destroyed in a matter of months. But for Hannah, victory was complicated. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt sad. She felt angry. She felt violated. Catherine had taken something from her that was very difficult to get back, the ability to trust that therapy was safe. Catherine had made Hannah question everything she'd learned about herself in therapy. Catherine had injected doubt into Hannah's healing process. And while professional consequences had been imposed, Catherine would never fully understand what she'd done. Catherine had spent the investigation and the hearing defending herself, not reflecting on the harm she'd caused. Catherine would likely go on believing her own narrative, that she was wrongfully persecuted, that these clients were ungrateful, that she'd done nothing wrong. The victory in the licensing board was real, but it didn't heal Hannah. After the licensing board hearing ended, Hannah had to figure out how to trust therapy again. That turned out to be harder than she expected. Finding a new therapist was terrifying. What if this therapist also had secrets? What if this therapist was also hiding a relationship that affected their clinical judgment? What if she couldn't trust anyone in a position of authority ever again? She found a therapist named Dr. Amir. In the first session, Hannah was guarded. She was scared. She was hyper-vigilant about every word Dr. Amir said. She was looking for lies. She was looking for betrayal. Dr. Amir immediately said something that helped. What happened to you was a professional violation. That wasn't your fault. And it wasn't your fault that you trusted someone in a position of authority. Your job now isn't to be hyper-vigilant about me. Your job is to heal. If you ever feel concerned about my objectivity or my boundaries, you have the right to address that. But I want you to know up front, I keep detailed records of my personal life, and I don't see clients who are related to or connected with my personal relationships. That's a boundary I maintain to protect my clients. It wasn't a perfect promise. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was transparency. It was acknowledgement of boundaries. It was someone taking the therapeutic relationship seriously. Slowly, over months, Hannah began to rebuild trust in the therapeutic relationship. With Dr. Amir, Hannah processed the new trauma, not Derek's abuse, but Catherine's betrayal, the violation of being gaslit by her therapist, the feeling that every moment of genuine progress in therapy had been tainted by the knowledge that Catherine wasn't actually on her side. She had to grieve. She had to be angry. She had to sit with the injustice that Catherine would never fully understand what she'd done and would never apologize. Over time, Hannah began to heal. Not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. By year 3 of working with Dr. Amir, Hannah started noticing something in her nonprofit work. She was a program coordinator at a domestic violence organization. She worked with survivors of abuse, helping them navigate systems and resources. But she was also starting to notice something troubling in her own organization. There were institutional dynamics that echoed Catherine's behavior. Not abuse exactly, but a kind of institutional corruption. Leaders who prioritized their own needs over client protection. Governance structures that enabled people to hide inappropriate behavior. Systems that failed to protect the vulnerable people they served. Hannah began documenting these patterns. She talked to colleagues. She found that other staff members saw it too, but nobody knew how to name it or address it systematically. She started researching organizational ethics. She learned about institutional safeguarding. She learned about how organizations, especially ones that position themselves as protective spaces, can become places where harm happens invisibly, the way Catherine's therapy office had. Hannah realized something. Catherine wasn't an anomaly. Catherine was a symptom of a larger problem. Organizations, whether therapeutic practices or nonprofits or corporations, create cultures that enable boundary violations. And those cultures aren't fixed by individual accountability alone. They're fixed by systemic change. By year 5 after Catherine's license was revoked, Hannah had developed a comprehensive training program for organizational leaders and staff. The training was called Institutional Safeguarding, Recognizing and Preventing Internal Corruption. It covered how organizations enable boundary violations through structural blind spots, red flags in leadership behavior that signal ethical drift, how to create accountability structures that actually work, how to protect vulnerable populations within organizational settings, how to recognize when institutional culture has become harmful. Hannah piloted the training at her own nonprofit first. The results were significant. Staff members reported feeling safer. Leadership became more transparent about decision-making. Formal complaint procedures were strengthened. The organization began changing from within. Other nonprofits heard about the training. They wanted it. Corporations wanted it. Universities wanted it. By year 7, Hannah had moved to a consulting firm that specialized in organizational change. She wasn't leading a support group for therapy survivors. She wasn't writing essays about her personal betrayal. She was walking into boardrooms and training organizational leaders about the institutional conditions that enable people like Catherine to cause harm. Her work was no longer personal. It was systemic. She consulted with nonprofits on how to structure governance to prevent executive corruption. She trained corporate boards on how to recognize when leadership had become compromised by personal interests. She worked with universities on how to create institutional safeguards in mentorship relationships and faculty dynamics. Hannah learned something through this work. Most people don't set out to become corrupt. They rationalize. They convince themselves. They look at their own interests, and slowly, incrementally, the line between protecting themselves and harming others gets blurry. Catherine didn't wake up one day deciding to harm Hannah. Catherine rationalized. Catherine told herself stories about Derek being the victim. Catherine convinced herself that her relationship with Derek was separate from her professional judgment. Understanding this, understanding that corruption usually happens through rationalization, not through malice, gave Hannah a different way to approach her work. She wasn't trying to hunt villains. She was trying to build systems that make rationalization harder. Systems with checks and balances. Systems with transparency. Systems with real accountability. Hannah still saw Dr. Amir once a month. They weren't processing the betrayal anymore. They were processing the complexity of working with people and organizations, of trying to create change, of holding people accountable without destroying them. She had a long-term relationship with someone she met at work, someone stable, someone who respected boundaries, someone who had their own therapist and believed in accountability. She wasn't trying to fix them. She wasn't trying to save them. She was just building a life with someone who understood that trust is built through consistency and boundaries, not through promises. 5 years into her consulting work, Hannah was training a room full of nonprofit executive directors. She was showing them how their own organizations had blind spots, how they'd prioritized protecting their reputations over protecting their staff and clients, how they'd rationalized away ethical concerns. One director, a woman maybe 10 years older than Hannah, raised her hand. She said, "I recognize myself in this, the rationalization part. I've been the person who convinced myself my own interests weren't affecting my judgment." Hannah looked at her and said, "Then you're in a position to change it, not by flagellating yourself with guilt, but by building different systems." That's the work. This was Hannah's transformation. Not redemption through public speaking, not healing through helping victims, but systemic change built by someone who understood, from lived experience, exactly how good intentions curdle into institutional corruption. Hannah had learned that most betrayals don't happen through obvious villainy. They happen through rationalization. They happen when systems are weak. They happen when people with power convince themselves that their needs matter more than their responsibilities. And she'd learned that fixing this wasn't about identifying villains and destroying them. It was about building institutions strong enough to prevent people from becoming villains in the first place.
Like this video and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.